So far, we've been talking a fair amount about the Enlightenment in Europe. Now, the big question, if you are skeptical like me, and if so, I feel sorry for you, is to what extent does an event that's mostly going on in Europe have on the American colonies? Because there's a little bit of an ocean that those ideas have to cross. And remember that by this point, the experiences that Europeans and their colonists have are very, very different. Take, for example, Cotton Mather. So, Cotton Mather is from a dynasty of Congregationalist ministers in Massachusetts. And if you remember our description of the Congregationalist churches and the Puritans, you know that Puritan dynasties are actually kind of a thing. So, Cotton Mather was one of the judges at the Salem witch trial. And therefore, he kind of has a reputation of being this very theocratic, zealous, fundamentalist person. In a lot of respects, he was. So the question is, isn't this the kind of person that Voltaire is talking about? Being dangerous, let's say having this fanatical view of religion and all that. What's kind of interesting about Cotton Mather, though, is that Cotton Mather is kind of a representation of what the Enlightenment can look like in the American colonies. Or if not the Enlightenment, then maybe the Scientific Revolution. Because on the one hand, yes, Cotton Mather is somebody who held very absolutist views of the Puritan faith and his religion, but at the same time, he could be fairly open-minded. Salem witch trials aside. So, for example, when he heard that a smallpox outbreak was happening in Massachusetts, he heard from a slave who, by the name of Onesimus, who was one of his household servants. Remember that, by the way, slavery was rare in Massachusetts, but slaves themselves could, comprise about 1 to 3% of the population, mostly domestic servants. But Onesimus told Cotton Mather that in Africa, that it was not uncommon for plague survivors to basically donate some of their blood and some of the, let's say, one of the smallpox, like literally one of the sores on the flesh would be cut off, and you would basically expose a potential smallpox plague victim to one of the sores of a plague survivor. In other words, we're talking about early efforts at inoculation. Now, what's interesting about this is that Cotton Mather is, again, a Puritan. He is somebody who believes that diseases are a divine punishment from God. Going back to that whole idea of, the idea that the Puritan vision of God is omniscient, and so if you suffer from a plague, something's wrong with you. But he also believed that God provided a scientific solution to the problem of disease. So, in other words, if you're thinking that the Pilgrims, the Puritans, that these religious refugees are going to be more skeptical about the Enlightenment, about the scientific revolution, you might be a little surprised. And the reason why I bring that up is that I said at the very beginning of our discussion about the Enlightenment that there is an American Enlightenment and that there's a European Enlightenment. And there is considerable overlap, especially when you're talking about politics. But remember that the impetus for the Enlightenment in Europe is religion, and more specifically, the power that organized religion has over society. And in some parts of Massachusetts, of course, the church was all powerful. But remember that in almost all the colonies, there is this strong tradition of separation of church and state. And with the Great Awakening, what we're seeing is that religion is simultaneously becoming a more powerful social and political force, but at the same time, the size and power of denominations are decreasing as religion becomes a lot more diverse. Again, you do see in parts of New England the church play an explicitly political role, but that's kind of the exception to the rule. For the most part, there is no established church or theocratic system that colonists are kind of butting up against. And you're like, well, Mr. Dry, what about the Salem witch trials that you just mentioned? Well, that's true, but again, if you look at Massachusetts in general, Salem is what happened in the Salem witch trial. We can kind of explain that away by saying that it's a trial that is almost a reaction to the fact that it seems like people are falling away from religious life to a certain extent, at least in New England. Um, so the reason I bring this up is that the American Enlightenment and the European Enlightenment have very different reference points. We sort of accept the Enlightenment ideas on politics, on social contract theory, on natural rights, but we don't, let's say, embrace the American colonies don't necessarily embrace the religious criticism that comes with it, and partially that's just because we don't need to. There's no sort of established church in the American colonies that is all powerful that has to be kind of pushed back. The other part that I hope you guys remember is the question of how much does the European Enlightenment really impact the British American colonies and the American Enlightenment in general. Remember that John Locke is talking about the social contract, is talking about the idea that sovereignty and legitimacy come from the people, not necessarily from God. And yet, at the same time, if you remember the Mayflower Compact, the Pilgrims were basically talking about that very same idea, not in some sort of grandiloquent philosophical kind of way, but in a, oh crap, we are settling where we're not supposed to be, so we have to offer some kind of justification for doing so. So that's something for us to think maybe a little critically about. Yes, in your civics class and maybe in some of your other history classes, yes, the Enlightenment plus taxation without representation plus the Great Awakening equals the American Revolution. That's kind of like the simplistic version. But as AP history students, you have to think a little bit more critically about that. Is the European Enlightenment influential, or is what we consider the Enlightenment of the American colonies more just Americans doing our own thing? Remember that we see many examples of colonial legislatures forming organically in the American colonies, not based upon some Lockean idea of the social contract, but based on the idea that taxes have to be collected and governments have to operate at some level. So, how much of it is the Enlightenment? How much of it is, colonists being forced to kind of rough it? But speaking of colonial legislatures and royal governments appointed by the crown, we do see more conflicts between colonial populations and the governments appointed to rule over them. And over the last century or so, the general trend has been for the old joint stock companies that ran many of these early British colonies to fade away, and in their place we see the creation of royal colonies, where you have royal governors that rule on behalf of the king. And also remember that very often they governed alongside their colonial legislatures, but sometimes that relationship could be incredibly acrimonious and confrontational. So this brings us to the Zinger trial in 1735 in the colony of New York. And remember that the royal colony of New York is a pretty unique one. You have, let's say, a large Dutch-speaking population, but at the same time, you're also seeing this growing English-speaking population, and the population in general is becoming more anglicized. New York City is becoming, formerly called New Amsterdam, is becoming a much more significant port city, and New York is increasingly becoming a very prestigious colony. So in 17 in the actually the early 1730s, you see the appointment of a governor by the name of William Cosby. And the thing is that many of these royal governors, if you remember, are royal governors not because they have this commitment to public service, but because being a royal governor isn't very difficult, and you can draw a large salary if you govern one of the better and more, lucrative colonies, like New York. And so many of these colonial legislatures, if you remember, were formed to provide legitimacy for these royal governors trying to collect their salaries through taxes. That certainly applies to Virginia and the House of Burgesses, by the way. So, again, relations between royal governors and their colonial populations were never great across the board. Um, and so they became figures of intense public criticism. A lot of times that criticism could be kind of on the down low, but very often the criticism could be open and public. And we also have to remember that colonial Americans loved newspapers. They had this addiction to the printed word. And that's not me waxing philosophically and nostalgically as an educator. That's just objective fact. The colonial American population was one of the most literate populations on the face of the planet. Part of that is the fact that many of the colonists were actually, the colonies were a more middle class environment than many of the European societies that created them. You don't have extremely poor or extremely rich people. As a colonist, you had to have a variety of skills, literacy being one of them, in order to survive and prosper. And also, if you're looking at some of the religious dissenters, like the Pilgrims or the Puritans, remember that they placed a premium on biblical literacy. And to have biblical literacy, it also means you have to be literate, right? So, what's happening is that you see the emergence of this transatlantic newspaper culture in which there's this appetite for British newspapers. I think some colonial American newspapers are being circulated in the British colonies, in Great Britain proper. And so being a printer during this time period was actually a pretty good business. That's how Benjamin Franklin made his, I don't want to say fortune, but it's certainly how he managed to obtain a very comfortable lifestyle for himself. Now, it also attracted industrious people. People like John Peter Zenger. John Peter Zenger was a German immigrant who established a pretty decent printing business for himself. And remember, there's this insatiable appetite for news, and a lot of what people were interested in during the 18th century were what people are interested in today. Juicy scandals, political scandals, scandals of any kind. People are always nosy. But if there is an excuse for nosiness, it's when people act badly in positions of power. People like Royal Governor William Cosby. So William Cosby apparently got into a row, a conflict with the colonial legislature in New York. And apparently he wanted to establish a pretty decent salary for himself. And the colonial legislature said no. And so what Cosby did is he simply replaced the Chief Justice of New York with his own man. Chief Justice James Delancey, who was obviously a supporter of Governor William Cosby. The thing is that when you replace the people who are supposed to keep tabs on you with, your own friends, that kind of looks suspicious. You don't have to be Charles de Montesquieu to understand that there's a clear problem with the separation of powers here, or the separation of powers not working. So what happened is that the governor was attacked in several anonymous articles authored by somebody who went by the name of Cato. As we kind of see from Cato's Rebellion, Cato is a name that is adopted or attributed to individuals whose identity is not clearly determined. So the problem for William Cosby, who, by the way, has no reservations about going after people who criticize him, is that he can't find who is authoring these newspaper articles. And apparently, these were newspaper articles that were, having an impact on the governor's popularity. So, if you're William Cosby, what you do is maybe you can't go after the anonymous author of the articles, but you can go after the guy who printed them, John Peter Zenger. John Peter Zenger is charged with an offense called seditious libel. Now, sedition is basically treason. That kind of speaks for itself. But the question is, what is libel? Because the charge, libel, Libel, still exists today. Sometimes we use it interchangeably with slander or defamation. The way it works today is that libel is a written false statement which harms somebody's reputation to such an extent that they cause damages. So, for example, if you have a parent who's a doctor, and I decide to, let's say that they perform surgery on me, and I say that when your mom or dad sewed me up, they sewed me up with a scalpel still in my rib cage. Okay. That gets out, and people understandably decide to take their business elsewhere. But the problem is that never happened. So we have a false statement that lowers somebody's reputation to such an extent that it impacts their living. That's how libel works today. If you want to know what slander is basically that exact same thing, except that it's spoken, not written. Okay, that's how it works today. It's not how it worked in the 18th century. In the 18th century, the way libel worked in the British common law is that libel was a statement, true or false, that lowered the reputation of somebody in the community. So if all that's not bad enough, you also have the fact that the individual that Governor William Cosby personally selected to preside as Chief Justice in the colony of New York, James Delancey, was personally going to hear the case as judge. So the odds are not looking great for John Peter Zenger. Fortunately, Mr. Zenger has the best attorney in British colonial America to defend him, Mr. Andrew Hamilton. Now, at this point, there are some brows that are kind of furrowing in confusion because that might sound vaguely familiar, right? I'm not referring to another individual who's also a lawyer with the initials A.H. I'm not referring to Alexander Hamilton, who's born, who really lives a generation later. At this point, I'm talking about Andrew Hamilton. Andrew Hamilton decided to defend John Peter Zenger in court, which was, a bold move, all things considered. Now, Hamilton decides to adopt an argument that's kind of a long shot. Because by the law, of libel, Zinger had published a statement that had harmed the governor of New York. Um, Hamilton's point, though, is that, Zinger published that statement, but was he wrong? I mean, even if publishing a statement is the same as endorsing a statement, even if we believe that's true, he was kind of right. We have this principle about not shooting the messenger, right? Because the messenger is going to tell you some harsh truths that sometimes you need to hear. And that's kind of what we're doing if we're holding Mr. Zinger responsible for the stupid things that William Cosby does. And at this point in the trial, James Delancey steps in and stops Hamilton from proceeding further. As Delancey notes, in the British common law, it doesn't matter whether or not a statement is true or false to be considered liable. The only thing that matters is that damage to another person's reputation had been done, and Hamilton had already admitted as much. So game over, right? So Hamilton gets a bad ruling by the judge, and his goose is cooked. So Hamilton nods, and then he turns around and makes that exact same case, not to James Delancey, but to a jury composed of New Yorkers. James Delancey has his opinion. The jury of New Yorkers has theirs, and they're very different. And John Peter Zenger was acquitted. Not only do you see the importance of jury trials in colonial America, and of course, in the British legal systems, juries are also very important. But you also see some other fascinating developments. You see yet another example of the people resisting an unpopular royal governor. And when push comes to shove, it's hard for royal governors to govern without the approval of the people that they govern. We saw that with William Berkeley. We saw that with Governor Edmund Andros, and now we're seeing it with Governor William Cosby. Governors are all powerful in principle, but in practice, their power only extends to the extent to which people agree to support their decisions. I mean, if that's not an example of social contract theory in action, I don't know what is. But there's also something else magical that happens here. James Delancey was right. James Delancey correctly pointed out that truth was no defense against libel in British common law. As Delancey notes, the greater the truth, the greater the libel. In other words, it's bad enough that the statement caused damage to another person's reputation, but it's even worse because it's true. So now a jury has decided that that precedent is dumb. That precedent should be ignored. And remember that British common law is based on the idea of precedent, that court cases build on one another. Now we're starting from scratch. So instead of British common law being used and adopted in this case, we see something else. We see the birth of an American common law. And the first major deviation between American and British common law is over the question of freedom of speech. It's poetic. I mean, it kind of hits you right here, doesn't it? I mean, it does me. And this is I don't know how many times I've had to teach this, so it's a magical moment. Sorry, the Zoom meeting that apparently I had on in the background is ending. Whoops. So beyond the Zinger trial, we also have, whoa, My face became all scrambled and trippy and stuff. I don't know how to turn that off. I'm sorry. Just avert thine eyes and look at the slides, not at my face. You should probably do that anyway, but I'm sorry that anybody has to see that. Speaking of being sorry that anybody has to see something, let's take a look at Benjamin Franklin. And not, we're not talking about this Benjamin Franklin, but this guy. And to be honest, I kind of think that young Benjamin Franklin looks better bald. If you're looking for an American symbol of the Enlightenment, I think you could do. You really can't do better than Benjamin Franklin. If Locke is the symbol of the Enlightenment in Europe, Benjamin Franklin is the symbol in the American colony. So, unlike Locke, who is very philosophical and intellectual, Franklin expresses his views on government and society in a very different way. And by the way, that's not a criticism of Franklin's brain power. I mean, the guy was brilliant. Among his many other accomplishments is the fact that he is widely credited to have discovered electricity with his kite experiment. And, Franklin is one of those Renaissance men who sort of dabbled in everything. But also, we have to remember that life in the colonies kind of forced people to adopt a number of very different roles. So Franklin had to be a printer, but in order to survive in the colonies, it meant that you had to do a little bit of everything. Whereas if you live in Europe, you could specialize a little bit more. So it meant that many of the individuals who would eventually become founders were people of wide learning and broad perspectives, partially because they had to be, because that's what it means to live in the colonies. So it shouldn't be surprising that we get a book from Franklin that is similarly broad in scope and purpose. It is called Poor Richard's Almanac. This is one of those books that's easy to underestimate, but the book sold 10,000 copies a year like clockwork. It was probably the most widely read book in the American colonies and was so famous that apparently when King Louis XV donated a warship to the American colonists, he named it Bonhomme Richard, which basically means good man Richard, a reference to Richard from Poor Richard's Almanac. So what was in Poor Richard's Almanac? Everything. It was basically like this big literary Brunswick stew that Franklin would just kind of throw everything into. So you have sort of tall tales, anecdotes, you have self-help and DIY tips. I mean, it kind of runs the gamut. But you also see, most interestingly, some of the Enlightenment view on authority that was becoming more and more popular. Except that with Locke and Montesquieu, they tended to sort of discuss government in a more intellectual way. But Poor Richard's Almanac was meant for a broad audience, right? And of course, given the fact that 10,000 people a year bought it, which was that's a lot of people during that time period, it meant that it had to be created with a general audience in mind. So you get little pithy quotes like this. And by the way, I apologize if you're offended by some of the language I'm about to use. Quote, "The greatest monarch on the proudest throne is obliged to sit upon his own arse." End quote. In other words, what Franklin is kind of saying, just like Locke, is that you can, whatever your religious views, the king is just a guy. Kings have butts. People have butts. They're human beings. And so it basically adopts some of that, maybe the anti-authoritarian view of government that's so popular in the Enlightenment, where it's the individual that's kind of cherished and championed during this time period. So we have a very busy 18th century, especially the early 18th century. And by the way, it's about to get busier. But we have two very different developments. We have the Great Awakening, which dramatically impacts religious life in Great Britain and to a greater extent in the American colonies. And we also have the Enlightenment. And again, they overlap and to a certain extent influence one another. So one of the things that you should do and add to your portfolio is to fill out the following diagram. Or if you don't want to put it in a diagram, what you can do is just kind of, write it out freehand however you want. I'm not picky about the format, but what I do want you to answer is, what are some of the similarities and differences between the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening? How do they view the individual? How do they view government? Are these forces, are these two movements that kind of oppose one another, or are these two forces that complement each other? And it's also important, maybe, if you talk about, let's say, the difference between the European Enlightenment and the American Enlightenment, because that might impact your answer a little bit. So just think about those things. How are these two developments similar? How are they different? And that's hopefully something we can talk about a little bit more later. Until next time.